Welcome to QuickPoly Getting Started. With QuickPoly, you can quickly create dynamic 2D primitives in Unity 3D. Using our highly optimized inspector allows for the creation of primitives visually. You can also instantiate, dynamically adjust in-game using our simple and easy to understand API. QuickPoly requires the minimum requirements: Unity Editor version 4.7.0 and is fully compatible through to the current version. Creating primitives is easy with QuickPoly. Simply head over to Unity's top toolbar and select Game Object, 2D Object, and select the desired primitive. You have three options. The first is to create. This will instantiate a default primitive. Create using last preset and create using most used preset will instantiate a primitive based on the saved preset settings. You will notice in the scene view we have a primitive created. If you cannot see the primitive, try rotating the scene view around. QuickPoly's primitives are created using Unity's mesh class, which means that they are vector and can be scaled to any size and retain the crisp and clear look without the effects of pixelation. Being that QuickPoly is based on Unity's mesh class, we support cross-platform development and all of Unity's build platforms. Instead of using textures, which greatly increase your game's build size, QuickPoly uses shaders to color the primitives. If you look to your right hand side, you will see the QuickPolygon inspector. Make sure a primitive is selected to view the inspector. We can create a preset by setting the name and pressing the Save button. We are now presented with more options. Selected states the selected preset. If we make changes to the selected primitive and want the selected preset to save them, press the Update button. Keep in mind that this will overwrite the preset to the current settings. If we want to load the mesh of a primitive as well as its settings, select Load Mesh and make sure it is selected. To change the loaded preset, we can change this by selecting Load drop-down and selecting another saved preset if one exists. We can delete a preset if desired by loading a preset and pressing the Delete button. Next, we can change the mesh type by selecting the drop-down and selecting the desired primitive. If we select Circle, we will notice a resolution slider. By moving the slider, we increase the resolution of the circle primitive. Keep in mind that the higher the resolution, the more processing power is required to render that primitive. Selecting the star mesh will give us the previous resolution slider, which will control the amount of star points. Inner radius controls the position of the inner vertices, which in turn will control the star's thickness. Currently, we have set rounding on the outer vertices, but we can change it to the inner by pressing Round Dense. At this time, you can only round the outer or the inner vertices at one time. By selecting the diamond primitive, you will notice it is rotated. This is because I set the square to 90 degrees on the Z-axis for the demo scene, which is what I have open now. By going to the transform component and changing 90 degrees on the Z-axis to 0 will fix the diamond's sideways rotation problem. Top width will control the two top vertices' width from each other, and the middle height will control the middle vertices' height between the bottom and the top vertices. Selecting triangle will change the selected primitive to a triangle, and the same will happen for the pentagon and hexagon primitives. Next, let's focus on rounding. Select all corners will select all the rounding toggles. You will be presented with the resolution slider, which will control the rounding of the primitive. Keep in mind that a high rounding value will require more processor performance. Deselect all corners will deselect all the current selected rounding toggles. You can manually select the desired rounding toggles by clicking on the outer toggles of the primitive in the scene view. This will allow for finer control of rounding. Next is fill type. When you set the fill type to none, it removes the inner fill. This is useful if you want to have the border show by itself without an inner fill. Selecting Unicolor will fill the primitive with a solid color, which can be altered by clicking on the color field. Selecting Linear Gradient will produce a linear gradient on the selected primitive. You are presented with two color fields that control the top and the bottom colors. Again, the color field can be adjusted by clicking on the colored field. To change the angle of the gradient, use the angle slider. The percentage slider controls the blending percentage of the two colors. Placing the slider at one end or at the other end will result in a solid fill color of the top or the bottom color. By pressing the Switch Color Slots button, this will swap the color's top and bottom values. Selecting Radial Gradient, we will be presented with almost the same controls as the Linear Gradient. Next, we are looking at the border. Setting the border to none will remove the border, allowing you to set only a fill on a primitive. Selecting Unicolor will add a solid color border around the primitive. Clicking on the color field to change the currently selected primitive's border color. By changing the outer scale slider will affect the outer scale of the border. The inner scale works the same as the outer scale but affects the inner border scale. Next, moving on to size. To change the size of a primitive both on the width and height, we need to enable the Uniform Toggle button. We'll be presented with one slider that will control the scale. Untoggling Uniform will enable two input fields, width and height, which can be adjusted to your requirements. Next, moving on to layer. To alter the layering of a primitive in the scene, you need to change the sorting and order of the primitive. The sorting layer uses Unity's built-in sorting layers and can be added and changed by pressing on the drop-down and selecting New Layer. By selecting a new layer, you will be taken to Tags and Layers Inspector. Minimize layers and select Sorting Layers to add or remove layers. Clicking back on a primitive will take you back into the QuickPolygon Inspector. The Order input field controls the order of the primitives within a selected layer. Setting the pivot point on a primitive is quick. Select the pivot drop-down and select the desired location. If you need a custom location not defined by the drop-down, press Custom. This will present you with an X and Y coordinates to manipulate the location of the pivot. You can also change the pivot's location manually by selecting and holding the white colored circle and moving the cursor and releasing it in the desired location. If you hold the Alt key, it will snap between the drop-down listed pivot point locations. To alter the collider, select the collider drop-down and choose a desired selection. Choosing None will remove any active collider previously set. Selecting Box will add a Box Collider 2D component that will automatically update when modified. You can remove this collider by selecting Remove Collider or selecting None from the collider dropdown. Selecting Fill Polygon will add a Polygon Collider 2D component, which will only be applied to the fill of the primitive. You can remove the collider just like before using the Remove Collider button or selecting None from the collider dropdown. You also must have a fill on the primitive to add a Fill Polygon Collider. Selecting Border Polygon will add a Polygon Collider 2D component to the border of a primitive. You can remove the collider just like before using the Remove Collider button or selecting None from the collider dropdown. You must have a border to be able to add a Border Polygon Collider. Adding a Fill and Border Polygon will add a Polygon Collider 2D component to the fill and the border of a primitive. You can remove the collider like before using the Remove Collider button or selecting None from the collider dropdown. You must have a fill and a border to be able to add a Fill and Border Polygon Collider. To enable lighting on your primitive, you will need to set lighting using the drop-down. Selecting None will remove the lighting ability from the primitive. Setting to Unity 3D will allow you to use any Unity 3D light. Setting the facing direction to forward will allow the primitive to be displayed only in the forward direction. Setting the facing direction to backward will display the primitive only from the backward direction. Setting the primitive to display from both directions, we will use double-sided, which will display the primitive in both forward and backwards facing directions. Using Unity's transform component, we can set the position and rotation of the primitive. I recommend not changing the scale of the primitive from Unity's transform component, as this will lead to a non-uniform border. QuickPoly's primitives can be dynamically adjusted in-game using our simple and easy to understand API, which can be found in our documentation PDF included with QuickPoly or on our website at QuickPoly.com. I appreciate you taking your time to check out QuickPoly, and I hope you enjoy your time with it. If you have any questions, concerns, feature requests, or have managed to find a bug, please let us know. Thanks again.